Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker I met and came to know and has become a good friend after Dorothy had died and Georgina started research on the biography that she wrote of Dorothy Hodgkin. She had hoped to meet Dorothy, but sadly Dorothy died before that meeting took place. And I hope some of you have read this book. In fact, I hope all of you read this book, because it's beautifully written and you would never know that Georgina hadn't, in fact, met Dorothy at some time during her life. So just as an advertise, that's the book, and I keep it with me for reference for dates when I forget them. And it's brilliantly done. And of course, Georgina is a science writer, and she's gone on to write other biographies since. But Georgina, I invite you this afternoon to present your talk to us, which is now going to be on Max Perutz.
And here's the book about Max Perutz. Just
Second edition.
No, this is the original edition of Max Perutz. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just get myself armed with my clicker. Yes, it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon to discuss the life and work of Max Perutz. And I'm going to be talking, in contrast to Elspeth, I'm going to be talking much more about the life than the work. Because, as well, Judith said I didn't meet Dorothy, but also I'm not a chemist. And there are people here, in fact, I think probably more or less everybody here knows more about chemistry than I do. So I'm not going to dare to get too much into the chemistry. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Max's approach to science and his philosophy and personality. So in his long life, he had many opportunities to reflect on the nature of scientific endeavour and the qualities required for success. He believed that scientists were as different from one another as anybody in any other walk of life, but that what the quality that they shared was creativity. He said, imagination comes first, both in artistic and scientific creation, but while the artist is confined only by the prescriptions imposed by himself and the culture surrounding him, the scientist has nature and his critical colleagues always looking over his shoulder. And Max learned that lesson the hard way. In the early days of his career, he was as guilty as anyone of seeing what he wanted to see. He was very enthusiastic and inclined to leap to conclusions before they were really warranted. And he suffered the humiliation of seeing Francis Crick, who was at the time his graduate student, completely demolish the basis for the first two papers that Max had written for the Royal Society on the structure of haemoglobin. And as Max said, he had to face the stark truth that I had wasted the best years of my life trying to solve a seemingly insoluble problem. But even though he went through bleak moments like this, and even though solving the structure of haemoglobin eventually took him 24 years, Max never gave up. And another of the qualities of successful scientists is that they don't give up in the face of disappointment or failure. And he also learned that there's no such thing as a wrong result in science. And he quoted his mentor, Lawrence Bragg, who we've heard about before, that you should look at your result with a loving eye and ask, what is it trying to tell you? And only a year after Crick's bombshell, it was Max who first calculated theoretically that if he could introduce a heavy atom into the haemoglobin molecule, it would in fact produce enough of a difference in the diffraction image to lead to a solution. I think a lot of people thought up till that point that although you might be able to do this soaking and get your heavy atoms in, they wouldn't make enough of a difference. But he calculated that they would, and very soon after, the biochemist Bernal Ingram joined his lab and very quickly managed to make mercury derivatives of haemoglobin. So these insights of Max's into the nature of scientific inquiry came at the end of a long and ultimately successful career. But what was going on in the mind of the young Max as he set out, and what were the obstacles that stood in his way? So Max was born into a wealthy family in Vienna and lacked nothing in material sense. But he disappointed his mother by being no good at dancing or fencing or other social pursuits. All she really cared about was that he should be mixing among the top levels of Viennese society. And he disappointed his father by being completely uninterested in taking over the family business, which was textiles. He was bullied at school for being small, short-sighted, and frequently unwell. And his self-esteem was at rock bottom when, in his later years at school, he finally discovered chemistry and found something that fascinated him and that he could do well. And he went to the University of Vienna. He is in his fourth year class. I'm fascinated by the number of women in this class, actually. So that's 1935. And he won the support of senior professors such as the polymer chemist Hermann Mark, who we've heard mentioned already today. The other things he could do really well were climbing and skiing. And overcoming challenges on the mountains gave him a tremendous sense of euphoria. He went on climbing and skiing almost his entire life. And the quote that I gave as my title gives some indication of how that tremendous feeling of euphoria he got from being able to reach the top of a mountain and see the view. So by the time he was 19, he was determined to do research despite his father's opposition. And his ambition was boundless. He wrote to a friend, actually an English woman who he'd met in Vienna and who he'd hoped would become a girlfriend, but she never did. But he carried on this long correspondence with her, and he said, "I turn in my mind terrible plans to avoid becoming a textile industrialist in a Czech village. One has to consider what will be lost to researching humanity if I do not concentrate on science and instead become a businessman. It would be very sad if the Nobel Prize had to be handed to somebody not worthy of it." Okay, it was a joke, but it's the kind of joke that only a supremely confident person would ever make. And this confidence led him to take a very big risk. The normal way of doing things in Germany was that you'd spend 4 years on a bachelor's degree, and then you'd move on to do your PhD in the second 4 years. He just didn't think that anything that was going on at the University of Vienna was sufficiently interesting. He'd heard about Hopkins's work in Cambridge, Frederick Gowland Hopkins in biochemistry, and really wanted to go and work with him. And he asked Mark's advice, and Mark ended up recommending him to Bernal. And he, with £500 of his father's money, he left Vienna and went to Cambridge in 1936. And when Max objected to Mark that he didn't know anything about crystallography, Mark apparently said, "Never mind, boy, you'll learn." And he arrived in Cambridge. Sorry, I have a picture of Bernal. He arrived in Cambridge, and Bernal told him, "The secret of life is in proteins, and X-ray crystallography is the only way to discover it," which is why I called my book Max Perutz and the Secret of Life, which some people objected to on the grounds that the secret of life is DNA. But nobody knew that in the mid-30s. They thought proteins were the secret of everything. So Max always told people that the only reason he left Vienna was because the scientific prospects were better elsewhere. But, we're talking about 1936. Hitler has already come to power in Germany. And he was very well aware of the political situation and the dangers for a Jewish family such as his. And before he left, he wrote to a friend, "If something happens, such as war with Germany, we will all be ensnared and trapped. One of the aims of my English stay is to search for a different path to the future." So I think he was somewhat disingenuous in later life when he said it was only the science that made him move. So on his father's advice, Max bought a bowler hat and a smart suit and turned up in Cambridge, where he found everybody wore baggy cords and patched tweed jackets, which somewhat took him aback. And he was even more surprised to find that nearly everybody else in the lab was a communist, including his boss. The political upheavals that he'd lived through in Vienna made him pretty skeptical about the politics of both left and right. But although his new colleagues found him a bit odd, they treated him kindly. They taught him the basics of crystallography. And the biggest difference between Vienna and Cambridge was really the complete lack of autocracy in the way labs were run, so students could choose the problems they wanted to work on. And he found that extremely liberating. So Max chose to study haemoglobin, and this is a quote from John Donne that he used to like to quote later. Obviously, that it wasn't the reason why blood is red was already known, but this is just a sort of metaphorical sense of trying to find out more about how haemoglobin works. So when he started this work, as we've heard already, haemoglobin was 4 times the size of myoglobin. There was absolutely no way you could solve the structure with the technology available in the mid-30s. And there was no computing power to do the analysis. and no one had worked out how to solve this phase problem. I'm so grateful to all the previous speakers for having explained all these points. And so the problem, as he said, looked more forbidding than some of the rock faces I had climbed on my holidays in the Alps. But he was able to get a crystal of haemoglobin and take a diffraction image of it. And so he had a very early paper in Nature, co-authored with Van Kuchen and Bernal on both chymotrypsin and haemoglobin, and there's their diffraction image. So there'd only been 2 previous papers on diffraction images of proteins at that point. The first was the one by Bernal and Crowfoot, as Hodgkin was before her marriage, which we've already heard about. And the other was a paper by Crowfoot alone on insulin. So she'd managed to get a diffraction image of insulin on returning from Cambridge to Oxford. So partly by accident, Max had already made 2 of the most important decisions in a scientific career, to choose a good boss and to choose an important problem. But the scientific problems became the least of his problems when Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, and he suddenly found himself a stateless refugee. His parents, his brother and sister all escaped. Many members of his extended family were not so lucky and were transported and murdered. His parents came to England with no money and no possessions. And I mean, as I tried to show before, they had lived at the top levels of Viennese society, and his mother never really coped with this sort of social and economic come down that living in a small place in Cambridge entailed. And Max, they depended on Max economically, which was a burden to him for the rest of their lives. And he had run out of the £500 that his father had given him. So just to fill in the time in the summer and earn a bit of money, he took a job as a glaciologist, studying the formation of ice crystals on a glacier on the Jungfraujoch mountain in Switzerland. And this became important later when he came on to work with Bernal on the project that you've heard about earlier, which I will get to. But in 1940, he was himself interned as an enemy alien. I don't have any, this is just about the age he was at the time. I could never find any images that properly illustrated Max himself in the process of internment, but he was interned first in the Isle of Man, and then he was deported to Canada, where he and a number of other Jewish refugees were held as prisoners of war, which they were furious about because they weren't prisoners of war, they were refugees. But at least it meant they were held under the terms of the Geneva Convention, so that they did get reasonably decent treatment. But that's saying quite a lot. But there was a huge outcry among the scientific community, and Max was able to return to the UK, which he wanted to do. I mean, a lot of other people chose to settle in the States if they could, but he really wanted to come back to Cambridge, and he did. He was released in 41 and came back, and soon afterwards, again rather against her mother's wishes, because she was German, he met and married his wife Gisela, who I want to include here because she was an incredibly important support to him throughout his career, and indeed gave up her own ambitions. I mean, she'd already been thwarted by her father, who wouldn't let her study medicine. She'd studied medical photography, but once she was married to Max and had children, she really didn't have the opportunity to work. She subsequently became a marriage guidance counsellor, but she would have liked to be a doctor, and she was certainly clever enough to have been a doctor. But I have noted in passing in doing historical studies that many of Max's generation had highly intelligent wives who relieved them of all domestic responsibilities and gave up their own academic ambitions. Today, such women would have careers of their own. And in 1943, Max was recruited to this project that was mentioned briefly earlier in the talk on Bernal, the Habakkuk project, to build aircraft carriers out of ice, which is, again, an incredible story, which I don't have time to go into in detail. It was actually bonkers from the start, but everybody was very taken with the true finding that this mixture of wood pulp and ice was incredibly tough. There were all these demonstrations done with army generals firing their bullets into this stuff, and the bullets ricocheting around the room in a highly dangerous fashion. But how you would build a vessel large enough to carry airplanes was something that people didn't start to think about until far too late. But the advantage for Max of working on this project was that he needed to go to the US to talk to some of the American collaborators on the project. And so he was given a fast track to an a British passport. And that was an incredibly important moment in his life. And he wrote to his sister, to have a home once more and a country to belong to, and to have achieved one of the most cherished ambitions of my life was quite overwhelming. Then he got back to haemoglobin, and he made his major breakthrough with the heavy atom derivatives in 1953, which, as you all know, is the same year that James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the double helix structure of DNA in the Medical Research Council unit that Max led. So he was still part of the Cavendish, but within the Cavendish physics laboratory, there was this unit for the research into the molecular structure of biological systems, which Max headed. And Watson and Crick and Kendrew all worked in that unit. And then Kendrew duly found his structure of myoglobin, and then by the end of the decade, Max had managed to solve the low-resolution structure of hemoglobin, which he was so proud of. He stuck it in his Christmas cards and sent it to his family. So this is to his brother-in-law, Stefan. Oh, there it is. Stefan and Prim, his brother-in-law and his wife. Happy Christmas. This is our happy Christmas. And it's just a picture of the low-resolution structure. And then came his Nobel Prize. Again, an amazing year for the Medical Research Council lab because, oops, sorry, I meant to hit that one. Max, Crick, Watson and Kendrew all came from the same lab and all won their Nobel Prizes in the same year. And that finally convinced Max that he was accepted by the scientific community, that his work was recognized as important, and that overcoming all the obstacles he'd faced in his life had been worthwhile. As he wrote later, I was a chemist, but worked in a department of physics on a biological problem. There were all these clever physicists who knew more mathematics than I did. I always felt very small in relation to them and not very sure of myself. But somehow the Nobel Prize told me I was probably quite good at research, and that boosted my determination to carry on. And the same year, in 1962, the MRC opened the Medical Research Council Laboratory of Molecular Biology, which we now call the LMB, with Max as chairman and a governing board consisting of several other either present or future Nobel Prize winners. I think, yeah, everybody in this picture, apart from Hugh Huxley, has got at least one, if not two, Nobel Prizes. Fred Sanger has got two. And they were the governing board. And as Elspeth mentioned, Max ran the LMB very much as a chairman. So there were 4 divisions, which had a great deal of autonomy. And it flourished as a research centre in molecular biology to the extent. I forgot to do the sum again before, because almost every year they get another Nobel Prize. Sorry, no, I'm exaggerating. There are at least 13 prizes. Is that what you think that's right? 13 prizes for that single research institution, which is more than several medium-sized advanced countries. And when Max retired, James Watson sent him a message which said, "You have what we always search out, an eternal, intense interest in science, coupled with that marvelous appreciation that you've been allowed to do exactly what you wanted virtually all your adult life." And Max didn't stop working when he got the Nobel Prize. He carried on with his research, refining his understanding of hemoglobin in health, disease, and other species. And is this going to work? Oh dear. Can't see the play button. This is, oops, sorry. Now I've gone ahead. Never mind. That's meant to be a video. Because what he showed was that the molecule had an allosteric change when oxygen, when it picks up and drops oxygen. So the molecule shifts from one conformation to another as it picks up and drops oxygen. So he had discovered not only the structure of the molecule, but the mechanism. And he called it, he did have a facility with words, he called it the breathing molecule, which says what it does in more than one sense, because it has this sense that the molecule itself breathes, but it's also the molecule that we need in order to be able to breathe. Without haemoglobin, if oxygen was simply dissolved in the blood without haemoglobin, we would never get enough to sustain our bodies. So, but as well as carrying on with his work, he very much had a sense that winning the Nobel Prize meant that he could not only do what he wanted to do, but say what he wanted to say. He'd written a few popular articles early in his career, and he knew that he was a good writer. But only in his 60s did he really turn to storytelling again. And he began with a deceptively light-hearted account of his wartime experiences that was published in the New Yorker in 1985. It was just called Enemy Alien, and I do commend that to you. It's very much worth a read. And in 1989, he published Is Science Necessary?, which was a robust rebuttal of the anti-science movement of the day, arguing that science throughout history has been a humanizing influence rather than otherwise. And he went on to write a series of essays for the New York Review of Books and other publications, which were published collectively in his book, I Wish I'd Made You Angry Earlier. And that's a reference, have I got time to say this? It's a reference to a comment Bragg made when Pauling tipped the team at the Cavendish to the structure of the alpha helix, which is a component of proteins. And Max immediately went and got a hair and put it in the X-ray beam at a different angle, and immediately found a spot that showed that Pauling's theoretical calculation about the alpha helix was correct. And when he went to see Bragg, Bragg said, well, why didn't you think of doing that before? And he said, well, it was only because it made me so angry that I went and did it. And Bragg said, I wish I'd made you angry earlier. And he tried to exercise influence. Oh, I mean, I have to say, there are people who would say that, like other Nobel Prize winners, he has tended to speak out on subjects on which perhaps he wasn't the best informed person to speak. But he was, as I say, he was a very engaging writer, and I'm sure his writings in the New York Review of Books will have brought scientific ideas and scientific history to the eyes of people who would never otherwise have read it. So he was elected a member of the Papal Academy of Sciences, and he was invited to convene a workshop on a topic of his choosing. And the topic he chose was population and resources. It wasn't called family planning, it was called population and resources. I actually went to the Vatican and was given the files on this, and the program went through 19 iterations before they arrived with something that the Vatican was happy with. And in the end, Max himself didn't go. I mean, his health was precarious all his life, and being anxious about anything tended to trigger bouts of ill health, so he didn't feel well enough to go. But he was convinced that having all these clever people sitting around for a period of days discussing how contraception and abortion and the education of girls could help to control the world's population and therefore improve the health and well-being, particularly of women and children. And he thought those arguments were so conclusive that the church would immediately change its mind. Well, of course it didn't. But that was the kind of optimism that Max had about what science could achieve. In his last years, Max was a happy man, proud of his family. This is him with Gisela, his son Robin, daughter Vivian, and his grandchildren and daughter-in-law. And he felt he'd had a life well lived. He fought some battles in his time, but as he liked to say, in science, truth always wins. I think he probably meant that people who disagreed with him would sooner or later have to admit he was right. And he wasn't always right. And there's a long story I could tell you about a battle he had where he just refused to back down on something on which I think he was wrong. But there's a more philosophical point that in the long term, individuals and the prizes that they compete for are less important than the collective endeavor of the scientific community. And here's another little plug. Oops, no, that's right. In science, truth always wins. He was a very good public speaker as well. He gave wonderful lectures. And that's, if you want to read more about Max, the biography is still available. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Georgina. That was lovely. Questions? Yes.
I went up.
Right, close to your mouth. Close to your mouth.
I went up to
Even
Cambridge
closer.
in 1966
Yes.
to read natural sciences, and I have to say what a wonderful tapestry of science was spread before an 18-year-old who'd only got physics and pure and applied maths at A-level. Max Perutz lectured to us in the first year on biology of cells, and he was a showman. He gave brilliant lectures, and I remember him bounding in one morning and saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, there are only 2 known structures of RNA. No, I tell a lie. The third was on my desk this morning." Well, of course, that was just a bit of showmanism, but it got everybody's attention. The other thing I would like to share is that Lawrence Bragg used to wander into our metallurgy practicals and poke around with what we were doing, which was a lot of fun too.
Lovely.
John Finney?
You mentioned the problems he had initially integrating himself into a laboratory which was very left-leaning. Did his politics shift in some direction as a result of his experiences, to your knowledge?
I think he was very wary of, as I say, of either extreme. I mean, obviously he was very opposed to fascism, but he was never really adopted by the left. He did not adopt the left. I guess if you had to put him somewhere, especially in the context of today, he may have been marginally left of centre, but I would say he was very much an internationalist, a humanist, not somebody who was interested in party politics in any way at all, but who believed in peace and freedom, which might sound a bit woolly, but I think that probably encapsulates his feelings.
That's a good start.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no further questions, I'll thank Georgina once again, and we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Tom Blundell.